The diner was quiet at this hour, just before the morning rush, when the air felt thick with the weight of silence and stale coffee. Julia Carrington stood behind the counter, wiping down the same spot she had wiped 1,000 times before. She didn't mind the repetition. It was familiar. She could do it with her eyes closed. Every day, the diner became her world, her purpose, her escape. She glanced out the window of the small-town Savannah café, the pale blue sky still holding onto the remnants of the early morning haze. The streets were empty, save for a few trucks hauling goods to local shops. It wasn't a place of excitement, but it was home. As she filled the coffee pot, her hands trembled ever so slightly. The pain in her chest had become a constant companion. It wasn't the physical kind. That kind could be healed with rest and a little time. No, this was different. It was a slow, gnawing ache. The kind that you carry with you every day. The kind that digs into your soul. She'd never gotten used to it. 2 eggs over easy, bacon crispy, and a side of grits. A voice called out from behind the counter. Julia turned to see Carl, the regular, already perched on his stool, his newspaper crinkling in his hand as if the paper itself was as tired as he was. Carl had been coming to this diner for nearly 30 years. He'd never once looked up to see who was behind the counter. Julia had been a fixture in this diner since she was a teenager, first working the register, then moving up to the back kitchen as her life, unfolded around her. She had become as invisible to him as the chipped tile on the floor. She placed his order in front of him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Here you go, Carl. Enjoy." He didn't look up. Instead, he grunted a word of thanks. It was the usual. It wasn't the lack of recognition that bothered her. Not anymore. After years of serving strangers, it was easy to tune out the noise. It wasn't even the long hours, the meager paycheck, or the way her body ached from standing for so long. It was the feeling that this was all she would ever be. That no matter how hard she tried, no matter how many times she kept her head down and pushed forward, she would always be just Julia from the diner. There was a strange comfort in being forgotten. No one expected anything of her. No one asked for anything more than a hot cup of coffee and a side of toast. But that comfort had started to feel suffocating. She used to tell herself that her worth wasn't tied to the job she held or the way people saw her. She tried to remind herself that a woman's life could be more than just the role she played in the service industry. But lately, it was getting harder to believe that. The door opened, and the bell jingled. A woman stepped inside, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She was a regular too, someone who always came in at this time to grab breakfast on her way to work. Julia didn't mind the woman's company, but she also didn't look forward to it. "Morning, Julia," the woman said with a bright smile, sliding onto the booth. Julia gave her a nod but didn't respond right away. She could already feel the sting of the unspoken tension. The woman, Sarah, was younger, well-dressed, and in control of her life in ways that Julia would never understand. It wasn't her fault, of course. Julia had always admired Sarah's confidence. But some days it just hurt a little more than others. Some days, the smile on Sarah's face made Julia's own mask feel even more fragile. "Good morning, Sarah," Julia said, her voice carrying the weight of a polite but tired greeting. Sarah was oblivious to Julia's inner turmoil. She never noticed the exhaustion in Julia's eyes, the way her shoulders slumped, the way she always worked harder than anyone else but never seemed to rise above her station. No one ever noticed, and for the longest time, Julia hadn't minded. She wasn't the kind of person who needed recognition. But today, something was different. Today, the words Sarah casually spoke to her, the ones she had heard countless times before, stung like a slap. "I'm so glad it's Friday," Sarah said, adjusting her scarf as she set her bag down. "Finally a break from all the meetings. My boss is a nightmare." Julia forced a smile, taking a mental step back from the table. "Sounds rough," she said, moving to refill Sarah's coffee. "I hope you get some rest." But Sarah's words lingered in Julia's mind. My boss is a nightmare. Julia wondered what it would be like to have a boss, or even to have a career that wasn't just flipping pancakes or making sure the coffee was hot. She had never really been able to afford the luxuries Sarah took for granted. Julia had tried to climb out of the rut before, but every time she reached for something more, life dragged her back down. Sarah's words cut even deeper when she added, "I don't know how I'm going to keep up with everything. Maybe I should just quit and move to a beach somewhere." A laugh escaped Julia's lips before she could stop it. It was soft, but bitter. A laugh that carried the weight of a lifetime of dreams deferred. The idea of quitting her job and moving to a beach sounded impossible. Laughable even. She didn't even have the money to pay for an extended weekend, let alone a move that would require months of planning. She forced herself to focus on the task at hand, filling the coffee pot, wiping down the counter, keeping herself busy. "You've worked hard, Sarah," Julia said, her voice steady. "You deserve a break." Sarah, unaware of the inner storm brewing in Julia, smiled gratefully. "Thanks. I just feel like I'm stuck in a rut." Julia's eyes lingered on Sarah for a moment longer than necessary. Stuck in a rut. Julia had lived in that rut her entire life. She had become comfortable with it. But there were days like today when the rut felt like a prison. The kind of prison that was invisible to others, but so suffocating that it made it hard to breathe. Sarah's phone buzzed on the table, interrupting the silence. She glanced at it, then stood up, gathering her things. "All right, Julia," she said, standing to leave. "I'm off to another meeting. I'll see you soon." "Take care," Julia replied quietly. As Sarah walked out, Julia felt a familiar ache in her chest. She wasn't angry with Sarah, not really. She was angry with herself. She had spent so many years pretending to be content with what she had. She had spent so many years convincing herself that this was enough. But as she stood there in the diner, her hands shaking slightly as she wiped the counter for the umpteenth time, she knew deep down that it wasn't enough anymore. Something had shifted inside her. She didn't know what yet, but she could feel it. The desire for more, something greater than this, was beginning to stir inside her, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. She stepped into the back room for a moment of solitude, trying to shake off the tightness in her chest. There was a mirror on the wall. Julia caught a glimpse of herself, tired eyes, an expression that was both weary and resigned. She was no different from the countless other women who worked jobs like hers. But today, something inside her felt different. She didn't want to be just another woman in the diner, invisible to the world. She wanted more. The sound of a bell jingled from the front. The next customer had arrived, and Julia wiped her face, preparing to return to the role she'd played for years. But deep down, she knew she wasn't going to stay in this place forever. Something was changing, and this time she was going to change with it. The sun had barely risen the next morning, casting a pale orange glow over the quiet streets of Savannah. The diner was emptier than usual, save for a few truck drivers grabbing their early morning coffee. Julia was cleaning the same countertop she'd cleaned hundreds of times, but this morning felt different. Her hands moved mechanically, but her mind raced with thoughts she'd been pushing aside for years. There was something inside her now, something she couldn't shake. It was the same feeling she'd had as a child, when she'd been told she couldn't achieve something, and then she would push herself harder to prove everyone wrong. But this time, it wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about proving something to herself. She thought about the diner. She thought about the long hours she'd put in. She thought about the stale smell of grease in her clothes, the constant noise of coffee machines, and the way people always looked at her like she was just a worker, just someone who existed to serve others. For so long, she'd accepted that role. It was easier to let others see her that way. If they didn't expect much from her, there was no pressure, no judgment, no risk. But that morning, standing there alone, Julia realized that she had been living in a prison of her own making. A prison where she confined herself to the familiar, to what was safe and easy. And the truth was, she had been afraid to break free from it. Afraid that if she stepped outside of that comfort zone, she would fail. The world outside the diner, outside her small-town life, seemed vast and unreachable, a place she could never belong. But something in her, the quiet rebellion, started to rise. The bell on the door jingled as another customer walked in. Julia didn't look up immediately. She felt a strange, almost calming sense of focus, as if she could feel the tension in her body slowly unraveling. She forced herself to stop cleaning for a moment and took a deep breath. This wasn't just another day. This wasn't just another shift. She had always told herself she was doing fine, but she wasn't, and deep down she knew it. Julia had been afraid of standing up, of reaching for something more, because each time she tried, the world had knocked her down. It was easier to be invisible, but the feeling that had been stirring inside her yesterday, the same feeling that had made her stand a little straighter, was pushing her toward something she couldn't ignore anymore. She had to make a choice. She could leave. She could walk out the door, grab her things and drive far away from here, start fresh somewhere new, somewhere where no one knew her. But that thought was a fleeting fantasy. Running wasn't the answer. No, the answer was right in front of her. It was the same thing she had been doing every day, without even realizing it. Staying. Julia had stayed all these years. She had stayed through the long shifts, through the gossip, through the broken promises. She had stayed when others had given up on her. And maybe, just maybe, staying wasn't the weakness she'd once thought. Maybe it was the strength she needed to find herself again. Her mind was still racing, but for the first time in a long while, she wasn't overwhelmed by the pressure. There was no need for grand gestures, no need to leave it all behind. The answer was right in front of her. She just had to choose to rise. Just as she made that quiet decision, a familiar voice broke through her thoughts. "Julia, I'm gonna need a refill," Carl said, his voice a bit more demanding than usual. She looked over at him. He sat, just like every other day, hunched over his plate, focused on the newspaper that he held too tightly in his hands. She wondered for a moment if he ever truly saw her. If he ever truly saw the woman behind the counter. The woman who had been showing up every day, working long hours with little recognition. She grabbed the coffee pot, her fingers a little steadier than they had been moments ago, and filled Carl's mug. He didn't say thank you as usual. He didn't look up either. It didn't matter. This moment wasn't for him. It was for her. The door jingled again, and this time the person who walked in caught her off guard. It was Tom, the owner of the little corner bookstore down the road. He was a regular at the diner, but Julia hadn't seen him in a while. He was always polite but never had much to say. Today, however, there was a look in his eyes that Julia couldn't quite place. He walked over to the counter, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Julia was seen. "Morning, Julia," he said with a warmth she wasn't used to from him. "Got a minute?" "Of course," she replied, setting the coffee pot down and giving him her full attention. Tom sat on the stool across from her, a little too hesitant at first, like he wasn't quite sure what to say. After a brief pause, he took a deep breath, as if gathering his thoughts. "I've been meaning to ask you about something," he started. "You know, I've been running the bookstore for a while now, and lately, I've been thinking about expanding, doing more with it, but I could use some help. You've got a great head on your shoulders, Julia. You're always working so hard, keeping this place together. I need someone who knows how to take charge. Would you be interested in helping me?" Julia blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected offer. Tom was serious. He was asking her for help. Julia couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to her like that. Not as someone who was simply filling a role, but as someone who was capable. Someone with potential. She felt a flutter in her chest. Was this what she had been waiting for? Was this the moment she had been too scared to acknowledge? Thank you, Tom," she stammered, her voice quieter than she intended. "I don't know. I've never really thought about doing anything like that before." Tom smiled, understanding her hesitation. "I get it. It's a big step. But I think you're ready for it. The bookstore's small, but it's got potential. And I think you're just the person to help take it to the next level." Julia's mind was racing again. She had always assumed that she was stuck in her job, that she was always going to be just a waitress, a person serving coffee and food. But Tom saw something in her. He was offering her a chance to step into a new role, to grow, to be more than she had ever allowed herself to be. The quiet storm inside her began to stir again. Maybe it was time to start believing that she was capable of more. Maybe it was time to make that change she had been avoiding for so long. "I'll think about it," Julia said softly, the words feeling like a promise she had made to herself more than anything. Tom gave her a nod, seemingly satisfied with her answer. "Take your time, Julia. Just know the offer's there." As he left the diner, Julia stood still for a moment, watching the door close behind him. The weight of the decision was starting to sink in. This wasn't just about a job. This wasn't just about the bookstore. It was about her, about believing in herself when no one else had. For so long, she had been waiting for someone to see her, to tell her that she was capable, that she could be more than just the person who made the coffee. But now it wasn't about waiting anymore. It was about stepping up. It was about taking the leap herself. She looked back at Carl, who was still hunched over his newspaper. He hadn't noticed the shift in her. He wouldn't, but Julia knew. This was her moment. She wasn't just staying in this town anymore. She was staying for herself. And maybe, just maybe, that was all she needed to move forward. The days passed in a blur of early mornings and late nights. Julia's decision to stay had not been a simple one. It had been a choice that required her to confront everything she had avoided for years. Her self-doubt, her fear of failure, and the crushing weight of the expectations she had internalized for so long. The early mornings in the diner became a reflection of her inner struggle. She would wake before the sun, still exhausted from the day before, but now there was a spark of something in her that hadn't been there before. Something that kept her going despite the tiredness in her bones. She didn't know if it was hope or desperation or something else entirely, but it was there, and it was enough to push her through the long hours. The cafe was getting busier. Word was spreading around town that Julia was opening a small cafe just down the road, in the space that had been vacant for months. Some of the regulars from the diner had already promised to stop by and show their support. The idea of people supporting her felt like a small victory, but Julia was too nervous to believe it would last. The self-doubt lingered, always in the background, threatening to overtake her. Tom had offered her the chance to help with the bookstore, and while she hadn't fully committed, the idea was gnawing at her. She found herself thinking about it during her breaks in the diner, when she was supposed to be resting but instead was planning what steps to take next. The bookstore was small, but it was a space where people came for more than just books. It was a community. Tom was right. She had always been good at bringing people together, but she had never thought of herself as someone who could lead. "I'm not cut out for this," Julia muttered to herself one evening as she stared at the menu she had drawn up for the cafe. The walls were bare, the floors still dusty from the renovation. But there was a quiet sense of pride in the work she had already done. She had put everything she had into that cafe, every dollar she could scrape together and every moment of free time. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was pretending to be something she wasn't. It was at that moment, as she sat alone in the dim light of the empty cafe, that she realized she had been afraid of this very moment. The moment where she would have to take responsibility for her own life, for her own success. She had spent so many years blaming others for her circumstances, waiting for the world to recognize her worth. But no one was coming to hand her the life she wanted. She had to claim it herself. The quiet hum of the refrigerator in the back of the cafe was the only sound. Julia's fingers traced the edge of the wooden table before her, the grain of the wood rough under her fingertips. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She couldn't afford to give up now. She had come too far. But as the days passed, the strain of juggling both jobs began to take its toll. The diner was more demanding than ever. Carl and the other regulars had become even more accustomed to her presence. And there were days when the mundane chatter, the clink of silverware, and the constant hum of conversation made her feel like a ghost, there, but invisible. "You doing okay, Julia?" Carl asked one morning, his voice low but laced with concern. Julia snapped out of her daze, looking up at him. "Yeah, I'm fine," she said quickly, offering a smile she didn't quite feel. He raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "You sure? You seem distracted. "I'm just tired," she said, wiping down the counter. "Lots on my plate." Carl nodded and then fell silent, returning to his coffee. Julia could feel the weight of his eyes on her, but she didn't want to discuss her new venture with him. Not yet. It wasn't because she didn't value his opinion. It was because she was scared that he would see her as nothing more than a dreamer. A woman who would fail just like everyone else who had tried to build something from nothing. But Carl's words stuck with her long after he left. "You seemed distracted." Maybe that was true. She hadn't been able to focus on anything other than the cafe and the bookstore. Her mind was always somewhere else, caught between the two lives she was trying to lead. The bookstore, the cafe, the diner, it was all too much. She had to make a decision. That aft on her shoulders, but there was something about the idea of walking into Tom's bookstore that felt like a small escape. When she entered, the cool air inside felt like a balm on her skin. The smell of paper and wood surrounded her, familiar and comforting. Tom looked up from behind the counter as she walked in, his face lighting up with a smile. "Julia, good to see you. How's the cafe going?" he asked, motioning for her to take a seat. "Busy," she said, rubbing her eyes. "I'm trying to juggle everything, but it's starting to get to me." Tom nodded sympathetically, his gaze softening. "I can imagine, but you're doing it. I've been seeing the progress you've made, Julia. You've got something special here." Julia smiled faintly. She didn't know if it was really special, but it felt good to hear someone else say it. She had always second-guessed herself, but Tom's encouragement made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she was on the right path. "I don't know if I can keep doing both, Tom," she said after a long pause. "The diner, the cafe, it's too much. I'm stretched too thin." Tom leaned back against the counter, folding his arms. "It's tough, I get it, but you've got a lot of potential, Julia. You're not just doing this because you want to. You're doing it because you can. And the people who are going to recognize that, they're already starting to come through. You don't need to do everything all at once." His words hit her harder than she expected. For so long, she had tried to do everything on her own. She had been the one who worked herself to exhaustion, trying to prove that she could handle it all. But maybe he was right. Maybe it wasn't about doing everything all at once. Maybe it was about taking the next right step slowly but surely. "You're right," Julia said quietly. "I've been trying to prove something, but I'm realizing I don't need to do it all alone." Tom gave her a reassuring smile. "Exactly. No one does. But you've got this. You've already come so far." Julia stood up, feeling the weight of his words sink in. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that she couldn't do it all at once. She had to focus on what mattered most. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. A real, tangible hope that she could build something for herself. The struggle wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. But for the first time, Julia wasn't afraid of it. She wasn't afraid of the unknown. As she left the bookstore, the weight of the world felt a little lighter on her shoulders. It wasn't going to be easy, but she had a plan. One step at a time. Julia hadn't expected the call. In fact, she wasn't sure she'd ever truly expected to hear from him again. But when her phone rang that afternoon, just after closing time, when the cafe was finally quiet, she recognized the name on the screen immediately. It was Greg, her ex-husband. A man who, over the years, had become an echo in the background of her life. Someone she used to know intimately but no longer did. For a moment, Julia hesitated. She hadn't heard from him in months, and to be honest, she had hoped it would stay that way. Their marriage had ended years ago, but the emotional residue had lingered far longer. He had left her behind, moved on with someone else, and continued his life while Julia remained stuck in the same small-town routine. He'd never believed in her, never thought she could do much more than the limited role he had assigned to her. She had long since accepted that their marriage had been a failure, but the emotional scars from his dismissive treatment hadn't healed completely. Sighing, Julia swiped her finger across the screen to answer. "Julia." Greg's voice was deep, but the casual tone felt like an old wound reopening. "Greg," she replied, her voice clipped. "What do you need?" There was an awkward silence on the other end of the line. Julia could feel her pulse quicken as she prepared herself for whatever this call would bring. She had no desire to rehash old wounds, but part of her wondered if this conversation would force her to face something she had been avoiding for years. "I heard you're opening that cafe," Greg said finally, his voice lacking the usual warmth. "I've been talking to a few people and, well, I have some advice for you." Julia's eyebrows furrowed. Advice? From him? She had spent years trying to move on from his toxic influence. And now, just as she was finding her footing, he had the audacity to offer advice? "I'm not sure I need anything from you, Greg," she said firmly, cutting him off before he could say more. "But thanks for checking in." Greg's voice grew defensive, almost condescending. "Julia, I'm just trying to help. I don't want to see you fail, all right? You've always been idealistic, thinking you could run something like that on your own." Her stomach twisted. Idealistic. That word had haunted her for years, always thrown at her whenever she had dared to dream too big, whenever she had hoped for more than her circumstances. The same word he had used when they were married, when he had belittled her aspirations, convinced her that she was incapable of doing anything outside of what he deemed acceptable. "I'm not a kid anymore, Greg," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the surge of emotion rising within her. "I'm doing fine on my own." There was a pause on the other end, and Julia could hear the sound of papers rustling, perhaps Greg trying to regain some semblance of control in the conversation. Finally, he spoke again, but his tone was colder now. "Well, it's just that, I know a guy who's looking to invest in businesses. He's got connections, and if you're serious about this whole cafe thing, maybe he could help you out. But..." He hesitated for a moment, almost too casually. "But you'll need to make some changes if you want to get his attention. He's not going to waste his time on something that's not going to make him money." Julia felt her blood run cold. Her fingers tightened around the phone, her nails digging into her palm. She wanted to hang up, but she knew that wasn't going to solve anything. Greg was trying to dangle a lifeline in front of her, but it wasn't the kind of lifeline she needed. This wasn't help. It was manipulation. "What kind of changes are you talking about?" Julia asked, her voice barely containing the anger she felt bubbling up. "I'm just saying you can't keep doing things your way. People like him, investors, clients, they want something bigger, flashier. He's got connections, but you've got to prove you can deliver." The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Greg wasn't offering advice. He was trying to take control of her life again. He was trying to push her into a mold, just like he had done when they were married. He wanted her to be someone she wasn't, someone he could shape to fit his own vision. The truth was, he didn't believe in her, and he never had. "Thanks for the offer," Julia said, her voice calm but full of resolve. "But I'll do this on my own." There was another long silence, and for a moment, Julia thought he might hang up on her. Instead, Greg let out a sigh. "Fine, but don't come crying to me when it all falls apart," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I won't," Julia replied sharply. "Goodbye, Greg." She hung up before he could say another word, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't realized how much his words had hurt her until after the call ended. The betrayal was subtle but deep. It wasn't just that he thought she couldn't do it on her own. It was the way he tried to control her even now. The way he'd inserted himself into her journey, as though she owed him something. For a few moments, Julia stood in the quiet of the cafe, letting the silence wash over her. She felt a wave of anger rise up inside her, a white-hot fury that burned through her chest. She had spent so many years feeling small because of him, feeling like she wasn't enough, like she didn't deserve anything better. But she was done with that. She was done with letting him have any power over her. The truth was, Julia didn't need Greg. She didn't need anyone telling her how to run her business, how to live her life, or how to fit into a mold she didn't belong in. She had been carving out her own path for the first time in years, and nothing, not even Greg's voice from the past, could take that away from her. She knew it was time to act. The cafe was small. The space was humble. But it was hers. It was hers to grow, to shape, and to make a success out of on her terms. Julia could see now that the very thing she had been afraid of, being alone, taking responsibility for her own future, was exactly what she needed. The betrayal Greg had offered her was the final nudge she needed. It was a painful reminder that there would always be people who doubted her, who tried to manipulate her, who thought they knew what was best for her. But the only person who truly knew her potential was Julia herself. She stepped outside, the evening air cool and refreshing against her skin. The sky was painted with hues of purple and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. For the first time in a long time, Julia didn't feel alone. She felt strong. She felt ready. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more moments of doubt, more times when she would question herself. But she now understood that it wasn't about avoiding failure or rejection. It was about pushing through it. It was about rising time and time again, no matter how many times she was knocked down. Greg had shown her one last thing. He would never see her as capable. But Julia didn't need him to. She would prove to herself that she was more than enough. She would build this cafe, and she would build her life on her own terms. No more letting people like Greg define her. No more second-guessing herself. It was time to reclaim what was hers. The days bled into one another, one indistinguishable from the next. Julia had long since given up on the idea of quick success. But as the weeks passed, something unexpected happened. The quiet, steady progress she was making on her cafe began to add up. The small victories, getting a new supplier for fresh ingredients, securing a local musician for weekend performances, or simply managing to stay afloat through the initial struggles, became the foundation for something greater than she had imagined. There were still moments of doubt, of course. Those voices in her head that told her she wasn't good enough, that she couldn't do it alone, still found their way into her thoughts when she least expected it. But each day, Julia grew stronger. She had to. There was no going back now. She was in this for the long haul, and as much as the fear threatened to paralyze her, the pride in her heart was stronger. She was finally seeing the payoff for the effort she had invested, though it wasn't always as glamorous as she had hoped. The reality of running her own business wasn't the romanticized version she had once dreamed about. No, it was hard. Long hours, uncertainty, and a constant balancing act between budgeting and managing the day-to-day operations. There were days when it felt like she was sinking under the weight of it all, but there were also moments when the smallest gestures made her realize she was exactly where she needed to be. One chilly morning, as the sun crept over the horizon, casting soft light across the empty street, Julia stood in her cafe, wiping down the counter after a long night of work. The cafe was small, but it was hers. The mismatched chairs, the old wooden tables, the worn-out sign outside. Everything about it was imperfect, but it had a charm. It had character, and it was starting to feel like a home. "Good morning," came a voice from the door. Julia looked up to see Mr. Thompson, an older man who lived in the neighborhood. He had been one of her first customers, and his steady presence every morning was a reminder that people were starting to believe in her cafe. He wasn't just a regular. He was a part of her growing community. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," Julia said with a smile, wiping her hands on her apron. "The usual?" He nodded, settling into one of the chairs by the window. "You bet. And I brought something for you." Julia raised an eyebrow. "Something for me?" He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled envelope. He handed it to her, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "I figured you could use a little good news. Something to make all the hard work worth it." Curious, Julia opened the envelope. Inside was a letter from the local Chamber of Commerce. She had applied for a small business grant weeks ago, but she had almost forgotten about it in the rush of getting everything ready for the cafe's opening. As she read through the letter, her heart skipped a beat. It was an acceptance letter. The grant had been approved. Julia looked up at Mr. Thompson, her eyes wide with disbelief. I got it?" He nodded with a grin. "Looks like it. That's going to make a big difference, don't you think?" Julia sat down across from him, the weight of the letter heavy in her hands. The grant wasn't large, but it was a sign that someone other than her believed in what she was doing. It meant she could pay for a few upgrades, buy better equipment, and even hire some extra help. It was a lifeline, and it came at just the right time. You don't know how much this means, Julia said softly, her voice shaking slightly. I've been so worried about making ends meet, about whether or not this whole thing was even worth it. But this changes everything. Mr. Thompson gave her a knowing smile. You've been working hard, Julia. You deserve it. This cafe, it's more than just a place to grab coffee. It's a part of this neighborhood now. And it's got heart. People see that. Julia's heart swelled with pride. She had been so focused on the logistics, the numbers, the day-to-day grind, that she had almost forgotten why she started this journey in the first place. She had wanted to create something that mattered. Something that gave people a sense of belonging. Thank you, she said quietly, her eyes welling up with gratitude. Really, thank you. Mr. Thompson gave her a warm smile and patted her hand. Don't mention it. Just keep doing what you're doing, and you'll go far. As he left, Julia stood there for a moment, the letter still in her hands. The world outside seemed to hold its breath for a moment, as if waiting for her next move. She could feel the weight of what was to come, the pressure of responsibility, the reality of owning a business. But for the first time in weeks, she felt something else. Hope. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from Tom. Hey Julia, just checking in. How's the cafe going? I know it's tough, but I'm really proud of what you're doing. Let me know if you need anything. Julia smiled, her fingers moving quickly over the screen to reply. Thanks, Tom. I really appreciate your support. Things are starting to look up, actually. I got a grant to help with the next steps. A few seconds later, Tom's reply came. That's amazing. I knew you could do it. Keep pushing forward. You've got this. Julia put the phone down, taking a deep breath. It was happening. It was really happening. The cafe was growing slowly but surely. But with each small victory, she began to feel like she wasn't just building a business. She was building a life. One that was hers. One that didn't rely on anyone else's approval. She spent the next few days carefully considering how to use the grant. She knew it wasn't enough to completely transform the cafe, but it was enough to make a real difference. She could afford to upgrade the kitchen, improve the seating area, and even add a few more menu items that had been on her wish list from the start. As she worked through the plans, she began to feel more confident. She was still learning, still figuring out the details, but each decision, each choice she made, felt like a step toward the future she had always imagined for herself. One afternoon, as she was arranging some new items on the counter, a group of women walked in. They were laughing, their voices light with the sound of friendship. Julia recognized one of them, Maria, the owner of the local bakery who had come in once before. She had been kind enough to offer some advice when Julia had first opened. And now, here she was again, bringing friends. The group settled into one of the booths, chatting animatedly. Julia approached them with a smile, ready to take their order. Hey there, Maria, she said. How's the bakery? Maria smiled warmly. Busy as always, but things are good. I told the girls here about your cafe. Thought we'd stop by and show some support. The other women smiled and nodded, each one giving Julia an encouraging look. We've heard nothing but great things, one of them said. We're excited to try it. Julia felt a rush of warmth in her chest. This was more than just customers. It was a sense of community, something she had never fully experienced before. As she took their order and moved to prepare it, she couldn't help but feel like all the late nights, the hard work, and the self-doubt had been worth it. Later that afternoon, Maria came up to the counter with a plate of pastries from her bakery. I thought I'd bring you a little something, Maria said. You've got something special here, Julia. Keep it up. Savannah's lucky to have you. Julia's heart swelled with gratitude. She had always thought of Savannah as a small town, a place where nothing much happened. But now, she was beginning to see it differently. This was her home, and it was hers to shape. Thanks, Maria, Julia said, her voice thick with emotion. I really appreciate it. Maria smiled and gave her a hug. You've got this. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. As the days passed, Julia continued to build her cafe, step by step, with the support of her community and the quiet confidence she had gained. She wasn't just serving coffee anymore. She was creating something that mattered. A space for people to come together, share stories, and find connection. It wasn't easy. It never would be. But for the first time in her life, Julia wasn't afraid. She wasn't afraid of the hard work, the setbacks, or the unknowns. She was finally building something of her own, something that was worth every ounce of effort. The days continued to pass with the cafe growing, both in business and in Julia's confidence. What had once seemed like a modest dream was slowly becoming a vibrant reality. Julia had learned to balance the responsibilities, managing the cafe, making key decisions, and still keeping up with her regular shifts at the diner. But something inside her was beginning to shift in ways she hadn't fully expected. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving. She was living. But as the business grew, so did the whispers. The same people who once doubted her now looked at her with curiosity, with speculation. Savannah wasn't a huge town, and people couldn't help but notice when something started to stand out. Julia had always prided herself on her independence, but as the cafe started to pick up, the constant attention, both positive and negative, became a double-edged sword. Her growth was becoming visible, but it wasn't without its costs. Every morning when Julia arrived at the cafe, she could feel the weight of the world just outside the door. It wasn't about the cafe itself, but the people she had left behind, the ones who had never seen her for what she could be. The one who was determined to rise, despite everything they had said. One morning, as Julia was preparing for the day, the door opened with a familiar jingle. She looked up from behind the counter to see a face she hadn't expected. James, a man she used to know well. They had once been friends, but life had driven them apart. James was someone she had always gotten along with, someone who had never judged her as harshly as others. But even he had turned his back when she had needed support the most. He had moved on to bigger things, and in the process, he had left her behind in a way that felt almost deliberate. James smiled as he walked in, his presence as imposing as it had always been. He wore a sharp suit, and his expensive cologne followed him into the cafe like a shadow. Julia froze for a moment, unsure of what to say. She hadn't expected to see him, and she hadn't thought about him in months. "Julia," he said, his tone warm but with a hint of something she couldn't quite place. "I've been hearing a lot of good things about your cafe. You've really built something here." His words stung, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Thanks, James. It's been a lot of hard work, but it's coming together." He paused, as if unsure of how to proceed, and then sat down at the counter. Julia set a cup of coffee in front of him, her movements slow but steady. "Look, I know we haven't talked in a while," James said, his voice softer now, "but I wanted to say, I didn't think you had it in you." The words hit harder than she expected. It wasn't just the fact that James had never believed in her. It was the realization that he wasn't alone. There had been so many people, in both her personal and professional life, who had doubted her, written her off as just another waitress in a small-town diner. He wasn't the first to say it, but hearing it from him, the person who used to be her friend, felt like a betrayal. Julia didn't flinch. She had learned how to mask the hurt, to hide it behind a smile, behind a professional exterior. "I guess I surprised you," she replied, her voice steady. James chuckled nervously, running a hand through his hair. "You did. I always thought you were content just, well, being the one who served people. But I see now that there's more to you." Julia leaned against the counter, studying him. She had spent so many years hearing the same thing from people. "You're better than this, you're capable of more." But it always felt empty, hollow, like they were just saying what they thought she wanted to hear. It was never about believing in her. It was about them seeing something she couldn't see for herself. "James, I'm not doing this for you," Julia said softly, her eyes locking with his. "I'm doing this for me. I've spent too long listening to people tell me who I should be, what I should want. This?" She gestured to the cafe, her voice growing stronger. "This is for me." James looked taken aback, his face unreadable for a moment. But then his expression softened. He nodded, finally seeming to understand. "I'm sorry, Julia," he said quietly. "I should have seen it. I should have believed in you from the start." Julia smiled, but it wasn't a smile of forgiveness. It was a smile of release. She didn't need his apology. What she needed was to stop waiting for validation from people who didn't see her worth. She didn't need anyone to tell her she was capable. She just needed to prove it to herself. "I appreciate that, James," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But the truth is, you didn't need to see it. I had to see it for myself." With that, James stood up, his face now tinged with a mixture of regret and respect. "I won't take up any more of your time," he said, his voice quieter. "But you've got something here, Julia. Something real." He left the cafe without another word, and for the first time, Julia felt a wave of clarity wash over her. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She didn't need anyone's permission to succeed. Her worth wasn't up for debate. As she cleared away the empty cup from his table, Julia felt something shift inside her. This was her life, her business, her path. She had spent so much time caring about what others thought, about their judgments, their expectations, but no more. The people who truly mattered were the ones who had supported her, the ones who saw her for who she was, not for what they thought she could become. She turned back to the counter, the weight of the world no longer heavy on her shoulders. She had walked through fire and come out stronger. This cafe was a part of her now, as much a part of her as the air she breathed. And as the sun began to set outside, casting long shadows across the room, Julia knew that she had finally stepped into her own power. Her past, the people who had doubted her, and the mistakes she had made were no longer anchors holding her back. They were the fuel that propelled her forward, the quiet reminders of what she had overcome. Julia wiped her hands on her apron and stood in front of the counter for a moment, staring at the small cafe that had become the cornerstone of her new life. She wasn't just serving coffee anymore. She was serving herself. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The late summer afternoon sunlight filtered in through the cafe windows, casting a soft glow on the worn wooden tables. The din of the cafe was a familiar hum, chatter from the regulars, the clinking of silverware, the gentle hum of the refrigerator in the corner. Julia stood behind the counter, wiping down the surface absent-mindedly, but her mind was far from the task at hand. Today was different. Today, the weight of her journey, of everything she had fought for, seemed to settle in her chest. She had worked hard, harder than she had ever thought possible, but the truth of it was finally beginning to sink in. Her cafe wasn't just a place she worked. It was a testament to her strength, her perseverance, and most of all, her belief in herself. The door jingled as it opened, drawing her out of her thoughts. A group of new faces walked in, their laughter filling the space as they took a seat at one of the larger tables. She didn't recognize them, but that was a good sign. New customers meant new opportunities. As she walked over to greet them, she took a moment to breathe, to remind herself that this moment, this cafe, was her doing. "Welcome to Julia's Cafe," she said with a warm smile. "What can I get for you today?" They each gave their orders, their voices light and friendly, and Julia felt the familiar ease of serving customers she'd grown used to over the past few months. As she took their order and moved to the kitchen, she found herself thinking about the path that had brought her here. The years of doubting herself, of giving more than she ever received, of letting others dictate her worth. She had come so far, but there was still something lingering, something she couldn't quite shake. That night, after the last customers had left and the cafe was quiet once more, Julia sat alone in the dim light, a cup of coffee cradled in her hands. The cafe had become a place of refuge, not just for the customers who came in for their morning fix or their evening meal, but for herself. It was here, in this space she had created, that she had begun to piece herself back together. But it wasn't just the cafe that had changed her. It was the people, the regulars who had supported her, the friends she had made along the way, the quiet moments of self-realization that had led her here. Yet, even now, after everything she had achieved, there was still that whispering doubt, that nagging feeling that she wasn't enough. That despite everything she had accomplished, she was still just Julia. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Tom. "I heard from a friend that someone's interested in buying the cafe. They're looking to invest. They want to meet with you." Julia's stomach twisted. The idea of selling had never crossed her mind. She had fought so hard to get to this point, to prove to herself and to everyone else that she could do this. And now, the very thing she had built, the one thing she was proud of, was being eyed by someone else. Her fingers hovered over the screen, unsure of how to respond. On one hand, she could use the money, perhaps she could sell and start fresh. But on the other hand, the thought of handing over what she had worked so hard to create felt like giving up. Was she truly ready to let go? She put her phone down and closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. This wasn't about selling. It wasn't about the money. It was about something deeper. About the worth she saw in herself and in the life she had built. She had spent so many years allowing others to control her destiny. But she was done with that. Julia had given so much of herself to other people's expectations, their desires, their doubts. But now, she wasn't just taking charge of her business. She was taking charge of her life. A few days later, after much deliberation, Julia agreed to meet the potential buyer. It wasn't an easy decision. The offer was tempting, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the cafe wasn't just a business. It was her future. It was her personal victory. It wasn't for sale. When the buyer arrived, Julia stood at the counter, watching as he entered. He was well-dressed, tall, with a confident smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Julia offered him a polite greeting, but inside, she felt a tightening in her chest. She had spent the last few years building this space, this home. It wasn't for sale, not now, not ever. The man sat down across from her, his briefcase placed neatly beside him. "Julia," he began, his voice smooth and professional. "I've heard great things about your cafe. I think it's got potential. I'd like to offer you a very generous buyout." Julia's heart beat faster as he laid out his offer. It was a good one, too good, in fact. On paper, it made sense. It was a way out, a chance to make a clean break and move on to the next thing. But the more he spoke, the more Julia's resolve strengthened. This wasn't just a business. It was her dream. It was her future. And no amount of money could replace that. When he finished, Julia didn't hesitate. "I appreciate your offer," she said calmly, "but I'm not interested in selling. This cafe is mine, and it's not for sale." The man seemed surprised but quickly masked it with a forced smile. "I see. Well, if you change your mind, let me know. I think you could make a lot more with the right resources." "I've got all the resources I need," Julia replied firmly. "This cafe has everything I've worked for, and I'm not giving that up." The man nodded, standing up. "I respect that. Best of luck to you, Julia." As he left, Julia stood behind the counter, her hands trembling slightly. She had said no. She had chosen to keep what was hers, to protect what she had worked so hard to build. It wasn't about the money, it wasn't about the offer. It was about her, her strength, her choices, and for the first time, Julia felt a quiet sense of victory. She had been afraid of losing everything, of not being good enough, of not being able to handle the responsibility. But she had stepped up. She had chosen herself. And in that choice, she had found something that no amount of money could ever replace. Her own worth. That evening, after the cafe had closed and the last of the customers had left, Julia stood outside, the cool breeze of the savannah evening brushing against her skin. The streets were quiet, but there was a sense of peace in the air. A peace she had never truly known until now. The cafe, the life she had built, was hers. And for the first time in a long time, she realized that she wasn't just surviving. She was living, and that, more than anything, was worth fighting for. The autumn air in Portland carried a chill that made the leaves crunch underfoot. Orange and red scattered across the sidewalks like confetti from some uncelebrated parade. Julia walked briskly, her scarf tucked snugly around her neck, coffee in hand, her breath rising in small puffs into the cold air. She had a stack of invoices in her other arm, the weight of them a reminder that running a business wasn't just about the moments of quiet triumph. It was about constant work, decisions, and responsibility. The cafe had grown, yes, but with growth came scrutiny, mistakes, and the constant hum of pressure that refused to leave her alone. Inside the cafe, the morning rush was already underway. The familiar murmur of regulars discussing neighborhood news, the hiss of the espresso machine, and the rhythmic tapping of keyboard keys from a couple of remote workers made the space feel alive. Julia moved between tables, making sure orders were correct, that coffee was hot, that smiles were genuine. It was a dance she had perfected over the months, a choreography of care, attention, and quiet control. But today something felt off. It started with a complaint. A regular, someone who had been coming since the beginning, stood at the counter with arms crossed, face tight with frustration. "Julia," he said, voice low but tense. "This latte, it's not what it used to be. You've changed something." Julia felt the familiar prick of guilt, even though she knew she hadn't. She forced a calm smile. "I'm so sorry. Let me make another one for you. On the house." The man muttered something under his breath and moved to a table, still frowning. Julia exhaled slowly, walking to the back, her hands tightening on the espresso pitcher. Criticism wasn't new, far from it, but the weight of it always landed differently now. Before, she might have crumbled under a comment like that, but today it felt like a test, a reminder that even as she grew, there were always storms to weather. The day moved on, a mix of small victories and minor setbacks. Deliveries were late, one employee called out sick, and a new health inspector arrived unannounced, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp and evaluating. Julia greeted the inspector with polite confidence, walking alongside him as he examined every corner of the cafe. She answered his questions without hesitation, offered explanations where necessary, and watched as he took notes, nodding occasionally. It was exhausting, and yet, she felt a strange thrill. This was another proving ground, another stage in the journey she had chosen. By afternoon, Julia finally had a moment to herself. She sat at the small window ledge with a cup of tea, watching people pass by on the street. There was a rhythm to their steps, a life continuing outside her little world. And yet, she couldn't ignore the tension growing within her. The cafe was hers, yes, but maintaining it required vigilance, attention, and a level of patience she sometimes questioned she had. She thought of the offer from the investor weeks ago, the temptation of an easy escape, and she smiled faintly to herself. She had chosen differently, and that choice weighed heavily, but it was a proud weight. That evening, when the cafe closed and the last of the customers had left, Julia went over the financials one more time. The numbers were good, better than they had ever been. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to reflect without worry. It was hard to measure what she had truly gained. Sure, she had a thriving cafe, regulars who adored her, and a business that would continue to grow. But more than that, she had something far more elusive: respect for herself. Her phone buzzed. A text from Sam, her longtime friend from Chicago. "Heard things are going well. Proud of you, Jules. Don't let anyone steal your spark." She smiled, feeling warmth spread through her chest. Sam had known her when she doubted herself most, when she questioned every decision and feared she'd never find her place. And now, even from miles away, he reminded her of how far she had come. The next morning, she faced another challenge. A shipment of pastries she had ordered from a local bakery was missing, delayed indefinitely. Julia's brow furrowed, frustration rising. But instead of letting anger take over, she breathed deeply, recalling the lessons of patience and problem-solving she had learned over the years. She called the bakery, negotiated a partial delivery, and improvised the menu for the morning rush. By the time the cafe opened, her regulars barely noticed the disruption. Mid-morning, a young woman named Claire, a local student, walked in. She approached the counter with nervous energy. "Hi, Julia," she said, voice soft. I just wanted to say thank you. Last week, when I was down, you gave me free coffee and talked to me for a while. It meant a lot." Julia blinked, caught off guard. She hadn't realized how much small gestures could ripple outward. "You're welcome," she said gently. "I'm glad it helped." Claire smiled, the kind of smile that reaches the eyes, warm and genuine. "I'm going to try starting my own little project this semester, thanks to you. I guess I just wanted you to know that." Julia felt a lump in her throat. It wasn't money, fame, or recognition that made this journey worthwhile. It was moments like this, the quiet impact she had on others, the small ways her strength and kindness spread. She realized that the cafe wasn't just a business. It was a sanctuary, a place where lives could be touched without grand gestures or loud announcements. Later that week, Julia received another challenge. One of the employees, Marcus, had made a mistake with a large catering order. The client was frustrated, calling and demanding compensation. Julia took the call, listening patiently, her voice steady. "I understand your concern," she said. "Let's make this right." She coordinated a new delivery, ensuring the client was satisfied, and when she hung up, she felt a sense of quiet triumph. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't flashy, but it was effective. She had faced yet another storm and weathered it with grace. That night, she walked home through the streets of Portland, the city alive with the hum of streetlights and distant music. She thought about the past, the years of doubt, the times she had let others dictate her worth, the moments she had almost given up. And she thought about the present, the cafe, her friends, the lives she touched quietly, the respect she had earned for herself. For the first time in a long while, she felt a calm certainty. She had been tested, she had stumbled, and she had faced the storms of life head-on. And yet, she had never let them define her. The challenges had shaped her, yes, but they had not broken her. She realized that true strength wasn't about never facing problems. It was about facing them, learning, and continuing to move forward, even when the world seemed to conspire against you. She reached her apartment building, the familiar brick facade welcoming her. As she unlocked the door, she paused, looking back toward the street. The cafe lights glowed faintly in the distance, a beacon of all she had built. And in that glow, she saw herself. Not the Julia who had once doubted every choice, but the Julia who had quietly, stubbornly, triumphantly carved out her own life. Inside, she poured herself a cup of tea, settling by the window. The city lights twinkled, the sounds of Portland carrying softly through the glass. She sipped her tea slowly, letting the warmth settle in her chest. The storm had passed. The weight of responsibility, the moments of doubt, the challenges, they were still there, yes, but they no longer held power over her. She had discovered something far. There, Julia allowed herself a rare smile. She had survived the storms, faced the chaos, and come out stronger. Not with fanfare, not with applause, but with the quiet knowledge that she had earned every step, every decision, every victory. And that, she realized, was enough. The city of Portland was bathed in the soft, amber light of autumn, the leaves swirling in a gentle breeze as Julia stood outside her cafe, looking at the scene unfolding before her. The space had become more than just a business. It had become a reflection of who she was, a place where both community and resilience were nurtured. The once uncertain woman who had walked into these streets now stood grounded, proud of what she had built from scratch. But despite the quiet victories and the growth of her cafe, something in Julia still lingered, a feeling that perhaps she hadn't fully left her past behind. Her phone buzzed as if to remind her of the unresolved chapters in her life. She glanced at the screen. The name on the text was one she had hoped to never see again. Greg, her ex-husband, the man who had spent years dismissing her dreams, telling her she would never amount to more than the life she had known. The man who had walked away from their marriage, leaving her to pick up the pieces of her own broken heart. The message was simple. "We need to talk. I'm in town. Can we meet?" For a moment, Julia stood still, the weight of the message sinking in. Her mind raced. She had thought she had moved past him, thought she had left the remnants of their marriage behind. But the years of living in his shadow, constantly second-guessing her worth, had left their mark on her. It wasn't just the man she feared. It was the memories, the moments of vulnerability, the the self-doubt that had once paralyzed her. She considered ignoring it. She had learned to say no to the people who never believed in her. But as the seconds ticked by, Julia realized that this moment, this meeting, was about something deeper than closure. It was about reclaiming the last piece of herself she had let him take. It was about facing the ghost of her past and showing him that she was not the same woman he had walked away from. Without hesitation, she typed back, "Sure, let's meet at the cafe. I'll be there in an hour." An hour later, Greg walked through the door, and for the first time in years, Julia allowed herself to truly look at him. His appearance was the same, well-dressed, his shoulders squared, but there was something different in his eyes, a softness that hadn't been there when they were married. It was as though the years had aged him, just as they had aged her, but in a way that hadn't been kind. "Julia," he said with a tentative smile. "It's been a while." She nodded, gesturing to the seat across from her. "Have a seat, Greg. What's this all about?" He sat down, looking around the cafe, his eyes taking in the small details. The mismatched chairs, the rustic wooden tables, the soft jazz playing in the background. Julia noticed the faint look of surprise in his eyes. He hadn't expected her to build something like this. He hadn't expected her to succeed. "This place is nice," he said, his voice softer now. "I didn't think you could do it." Julia's heart clenched, but she refused to let the old wounds resurface. "I'm sure you didn't," she replied, her tone steady. "But I did." There was an awkward silence between them, the weight of their past hanging in the air. Julia waited, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter, her mind shifting between the woman she was now and the woman she used to be. Unsure, afraid, searching for someone else to define her worth. Greg shifted in his seat, his expression serious now. "I've been thinking about you a lot lately," he said, his voice almost hesitant. "About how things ended. I never should have walked away the way I did. I didn't see what I had, Julia. I didn't see you, and I'm sorry for that." Julia looked at him for a long moment, the silence between them growing thick. She had spent so many years wishing for an apology, wishing for him to see her, to understand what she had been through. But now, sitting across from him, she realized something she hadn't before. His apology didn't change who she had become. It didn't change the strength she had found within herself. "I appreciate your apology, Greg," she said finally, her voice calm and composed. "But you walking away, treating me like I wasn't enough, it wasn't just about you. It was about me too. I let you define my worth for so long. I let your opinion become my reality. But I don't need that anymore. I don't need your approval, and I don't need your validation." Greg's expression faltered, and for a moment, Julia saw the faintest flicker of guilt in his eyes. He had always been a man who was quick to judge, quick to dismiss anything that didn't fit into his neat little box. But now, in the face of her strength, he seemed lost. He didn't know how to handle this version of Julia, the woman who no longer needed him, the woman who had found her voice. "I've spent so much time trying to prove something to you," Julia continued, her voice firm but filled with quiet power. "But the truth is, I was never trying to prove anything to you. I was trying to prove it to myself. And I've done that." Greg opened his mouth, but no words came out. Instead, he nodded, his eyes drifting away from hers. It was a look of resignation. He had finally realized that she was no longer the woman who had quietly waited for him to come back, the woman who had allowed herself to be pushed aside. "I just wanted you to know that I'm doing well," Julia said, her voice softer now. "I'm happy with the life I've built, and I don't need anyone to tell me what I'm capable of anymore." He nodded again, his eyes dropping to the table. The weight of the conversation hung between them, but it was no longer a burden on her shoulders. She had finally let go of the need for his approval, his validation. The man who had walked out of her life, the one who had once held power over her, now seemed insignificant. His apology, though it meant something, wasn't what she had needed. What she needed was this moment of clarity, this moment of closure that didn't come from him but from within herself. As Greg stood up to leave, Julia offered him a polite nod. "Goodbye, Greg. I hope you find what you're looking for." He didn't say anything else. He just left. Julia stood there, her heart beating steadily in her chest. The door closed softly behind him, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. The cafe, the business, her life, they were all hers, and for the first time she felt completely free. It wasn't just the end of a chapter. It was the end of a story she had been telling herself for years. The story of being defined by someone else's expectations. The story of waiting for permission. That story was over, and in its place was the woman who had fought for her life, for her business, for her future. The woman who had learned that her worth wasn't tied to anyone's approval. She didn't need anyone's validation anymore. As she walked back to the counter, her fingers brushing the cool edge of the counter, Julia realized something. She had spent so many years waiting for people to see her, but in the end, it was never about what they saw, it was about what she saw in herself. The streets of Portland glowed with the soft, golden light of early evening as Julia stepped out of her cafe, the familiar jingle of the doorbell ringing behind her. The cool autumn air brushed against her face, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. She stood there for a moment, letting the city pulse around her, before she took a deep breath and walked into the night. The world felt different now, somehow, quieter yet louder in a way. It was as if everything had shifted in the last few months, and she was finally seeing things with new eyes. Her cafe was no longer just a business. It was her home, a place where her strength, her dreams, and her soul had come together. She had built it from nothing, and now it was part of her. And in a way, it was an extension of the person she had become. Resilient, grounded, unshakable. There was no longer any need to prove anything to anyone. No need for validation, no need for anyone's approval. The doubts that once plagued her, those whispers of inadequacy and insecurity, had been silenced by the simple, undeniable truth that she was enough. Julia Carrington had made it. She had created something beautiful, something lasting, something entirely her own. As she walked down the street, she passed the familiar faces of the neighborhood. The mailman, the barista from the coffee shop, and the elderly couple that always stopped for a quick chat on the corner. They had become a part of her life over the past year, but it was more than that. They were a part of the community she had quietly helped build, even if she hadn't realized it at first. She hadn't expected it to happen this way. At first, when she'd opened the cafe, she had just been trying to survive. She had wanted to prove to herself that she could do something on her own, that she could make her mark in the world. But as the weeks turned into months, she began to see something else, a deeper purpose. It wasn't just about the cafe. It was about connection, about creating a space for people to come together, to share moments, to feel heard. And in that process, she had found her own voice. The sound of her phone buzzing pulled her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Maria, the bakery owner who had become one of Julia's closest friends over the past year. "Hey Julia, I got some big news. I'm expanding my bakery, and I want you to be part of it. I've been thinking of you as my partner in this venture. What do you think?" Julia's fingers hovered over the phone screen as she read the message. Maria's offer was unexpected, but as Julia thought about it, she realized that it wasn't a surprise at all. Maria had seen her strength from the beginning, had recognized the quiet drive that fueled Julia's every move. The thought of expanding, of taking the next step in her business journey, was tempting. It was the kind of opportunity she would have jumped at once. But now, Julia realized her path was different. She had found the peace and purpose she had been seeking in her own cafe, in her own life. The idea of joining someone else's project, even if it was a good one, no longer felt like the right move. After a moment of reflection, she typed back, "Thank you so much, Maria. I'm truly honored, but I think I'm going to pass. I've built something here, and it's where I need to be. But I'm excited for you and wish you all the best." She set the phone down, feeling a strange sense of finality in the decision. She had always been someone who had moved forward with others' plans, letting other people's ambitions shape her path. But now, she realized, she wasn't just following a road laid out for her. She was creating her own, and that was enough. Julia continued walking, her pace slow and deliberate. As she approached her apartment building, she paused for a moment, looking at the cafe across the street. The lights inside were dimmed for the night, and she could see the reflection of the neon sign flickering in the window. She smiled to herself. The journey hadn't been easy. In fact, it had been anything but. There had been times when she had wanted to give up, when the weight of the world had seemed too much to bear. But now, as she stood there on the sidewalk, looking at the place she had built, she knew that every moment, every setback, every challenge had been worth it. The past had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. It was the lessons, the choices, the strength she had discovered within herself that mattered now. Julia had built her life from the ground up. She had rebuilt her sense of self, piece by piece, until she could finally look in the mirror and see a woman who was strong, independent, and worthy. She smiled again, a soft, quiet smile of contentment. The woman who had walked into this city months ago was gone. She had been replaced by a woman who knew her worth, who didn't need to seek validation from others. She had learned the most important lesson of all, that her value wasn't determined by the opinions of others, but by the choices she made, by her actions, and by the life she had created for herself. As she walked into her apartment and closed the door behind her, Julia took a deep breath. The silence of the space was comforting, like an old friend greeting her at the end of a long journey. She walked to the window and gazed out at the city, the lights twinkling below. There was so much to be grateful for: the cafe, the people, the life she had built from nothing, and most importantly, the quiet peace she felt in her own heart. Julia's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Claire, the young woman who had thanked her for her support earlier in the week. "Hey Julia, I just wanted to let you know that I'm starting my own project, and I couldn't have done it without you. Thank you for showing me that I could do it. I'm so grateful." Julia's heart swelled with pride as she read the message. It wasn't about the cafe or the money or the recognition. It was about moments like this, the small, quiet victories that reminded her that she was on the right path. She sat down at her small desk, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows across the room. Her reflection in the window mirrored the person she had become: calm, strong, centered. Julia had fought for this life, for her peace, for the quiet, unspoken victories that mattered most. She had rebuilt herself from the ashes of her past, and now, she was living the life she had always dreamed of. Not because someone else had told her she could, but because she had chosen it for herself. There were no grand celebrations, no confetti falling from the sky, but Julia didn't need any of that. The quiet, steady progress was enough. The journey, every step, every choice, every victory, had been enough. She stood up from the desk and walked over to the window again. The city outside was alive with possibility, and as she looked out over it, Julia felt something shift inside her. A deep sense of contentment, of fulfillment. She had made it. She had built this life with her own hands, and she had done it her way. For the first time, Julia allowed herself to believe that she was enough. And in that moment, she knew that her journey was just beginning.